Ukrainian forces succeeded in repelling numerous Russian attacks in the Donetsk region. Russian forces want to make progress in the direction of Bakhmut by carrying out heavy attacks on many settlements in the Donetsk region. However, the Ukrainian troops are fending off all attacks so that the Russian troops cannot gain this advantage. Russian forces are claimed to have completely captured the city of Marinka. Although this has not been independently verified in recent days, Russian forces have reported that they have taken control of many settlements in the Donetsk region. However, satellite images taken from the region show that Ukrainian troops are conducting defense activities in many cities in the Donetsk region. Chechen soldiers in the Ramzan Kadyrov battalion fighting for the Russian forces conducted a limited ground campaign in the western Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled an attack near the city of Presheslavka, 60 kilometers southwest of Donetsk city in western Donetsk Oblast, especially in the city of Solder of the Donetsk region. Russian forces are trying to seize the dominance of the region by making heavy attacks. Despite this, Ukrainian troops continue to defend many areas against Russian troops. In recent days, since the Kremlin government's focus has been on the Donbass region, Ukrainian and Russian troops have concentrated on a narrower battlefield. This concentration had an upward effect on the increase in the number of losses. Ukrainian forces attacked the Russian army when they least expected, causing the Russians to suffer more casualties. Increasing casualties are not a problem for Ukrainian forces as long as there is no missing military manpower. The reason for this situation is that many Western countries lend a helping hand to the Ukrainian forces. Whenever the Ukrainian forces have a military need, especially the United States of America prepares an aid package and sends it to Ukraine. But the Russian army is not as lucky as the Ukrainians for Russian forces. Even if one bullet is lost, it poses a major problem. There was a noticeable decrease in missile attacks by Russian forces targeting Ukrainian positions. The source of this decline is the ammunition problem experienced by Russia. Russian industry cannot produce the ammunition that the Russian army needs on the territory of Ukraine. In addition to the limited ammunition, the loss of military manpower also creates a significant problem in the Russian army. With the partial mobilization decree, Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to forcibly enlist 300,000 Russian citizens into the army. But Russian commanders lost most of the military manpower provided by Vladimir Putin. If the Russian army goes at this rate, it won't have enough troops to control the temporarily occupied territory in Ukraine very soon. By changing the target priority, the Ukrainian forces started targeting the Chechen and Wagner PMC soldiers who were a more difficult opponent than the Russian soldiers. At their points, neutralizing the troops of the Chechen battalion will reduce the quality of attacks on Ukrainian forces. The probability of the Ukrainian forces being damaged in poor-quality Russian attacks will be greatly reduced. The Ukrainian army is scanning the Donbass region with the help of unmanned aerial vehicles 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unmanned aerial vehicles, which has been the Ukrainian army's most productive equipment since the beginning of the war, have become the fearful dream of the Russian army. Ukrainian forces both dropped bombs from unmanned aerial vehicles and provided intelligence to the artillery units by detecting the coordinates of the Russian army in the latest attack by Ukrainian forces. A drone under the control of Ukrainian air reconnaissance units detected an important outpost of Chechen troops fighting for Russia in the Donetsk region. It was determined that the police station where the Chechen forces are located also contains technical vehicles with high material value. Ukrainian forces destroyed the outpost with an accurate shot of the MT-12 anti-tank gun dubbed the Repel. This successful attack by the Ukrainian forces was carried out by the 36th Separate Marine Brigade named after Rear Admiral Mikhail Obolensky. 3 main battle tanks belonging to the Russian forces were detected at a point very close to the outpost containing Chechen soldiers, which is the target of Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces also managed to destroy 3 main battle tanks of the Russian army. The Repel MT-12 anti-tank gun used in the attack is a Soviet 100mm² anti-tank gun that entered service in 1961. Produced as a revolutionary in 1961, this anti-tank gun has been continuously developed with various variants over the years as the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine Ministries of Defense and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. Russian forces are trying to make up for the lack of military manpower with Chechen fighters and soldiers of the mercenary contractor. The Ukrainian forces had a hard time fighting the Chechen battalion of Kadyrov and the mercenaries of the Wagner PMC. Chechens and Wagner PMC soldiers who were more trained and experienced than Russian soldiers were more helpful to the Kremlin's invasion plan than Russian soldiers. Ukrainian forces are attacking areas of military concentration in order to sweep the Russian soldiers from the territory of Ukraine. For Ukrainian forces, attacking an area with thousands of Russian soldiers could be a huge victory. However, attacking an area with hundreds of Chechen or Wagner PMC soldiers would be a more effective move for the Ukrainian army in the course of the war. After turning his main focus to the Donbass region, Vladimir Putin relies on Chechen fighters in the Donetsk region and on Wagner PMC mercenaries in the Luhansk region. Vladimir Putin owes it to the Chechen and Wagner PMC soldiers that the Donbass region did not fall against the intense attacks of the Ukrainian forces in the days when the number of casualties of the Russian forces as a result of the Ukrainian attacks exceeded 115,000. The Ukrainian forces caused the losses of the Russian army to increase thanks to the counterattacks, since the counterattacks are made while the Russian army is in the attacking position. The Russians are caught off guard and cannot fend off the attacks of the Ukrainian forces due to the decreasing military manpower. Day by day, the Russian forces are attacking the Ukrainian troops without tactics in order to achieve success quickly. However, these tactical attacks by the Russian forces will not help them achieve success in Ukraine. The tactical attacks of the Russian forces will be repelled by the Ukrainian forces, causing the Russian army to waste only ammunition. Russian forces are putting the Russian army in a difficult situation by using their limited opportunities in the most inefficient way due to the decrease in Russian ammunition day by day. The Kremlin government aims to meet this need of the Russian army with several different options. Russian leader Vladimir Putin met with defense industry bosses recently and drew attention to the need to increase production since the beginning of the war. The Russian defense industry has been working its employees for long periods of time with additional shifts. However, the wages required for these working hours are not paid to the factory workers. The Russian economy got worse with the sanctions that came with the war. The Russian people suffered greatly from the great decline in the Russian economy. Now, workers who do not get paid for their work by working long hours in factories may object to this way of working. And Russian President Vladimir Putin's full-blown Ukraine invasion plan could take factory workers in one blow. The Ukraine-Russia war has become more and more difficult for people from all parts of Russia as it gets harder. The number of anti-war people has increased in all parts of Russia. However, Vladimir Putin's decree on anti-war people prevents anti-war people from taking action across Russia. If the situation of Russian soldiers on the battlefield continues in this way, the Kremlin government will have to take more drastic decisions. However, this situation will not be welcomed by the Russian people. As a result of these events, the Kremlin government will suffer, mostly Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian army continues its strategic operations. Developments in the war zone led to a heavy defeat for Russia. The Ukrainian army is advancing step by step to victory. Let's look at the background of these operations together. The Ukrainian army needs to be very clever to win this war because the Russian army is much more numerous than the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers know this, so they make very strategic decisions in all operations. Today, a new one was added to these operations. The Russian army continues to suffer heavy losses. The course of the war has now completely changed. All signs point to Russia's defeat. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine made a statement today providing information about the losses of the Russian army. According to this report, the number of Russian military casualties in this war is about 130,000. The exact number of wounded soldiers cannot be determined. Thousands more Russian soldiers who were hospitalized are thought to have died. In order to hide its defeat in this war, Putin's government does not make any statements about the number of wounded and dead soldiers. But this is causing anger among Russian soldiers. Ukrainian President Zelensky made a statement on this issue. Zelensky said that Putin does not care about that Russian soldiers. They don't even count their dead because they don't care about them. We are determining how many Russian soldiers have died. Zelensky's statements attracted the attention of Russian soldiers. Zelensky has been attracting the attention of Russian soldiers with his statements since the beginning of the war. Thousands of Russian soldiers left the army influenced by Zelensky's statements. Zelensky, a former comedian, knows how to influence people. His statements are changing the course of the war. Zelensky doesn't just make statements. He also gives orders to commanders for strategically important operations. Today's extraordinary operation was allegedly planned by Zelensky. By using drones, Zelensky can secretly monitor all movements of Russian army soldiers. The Russian army's air defense systems cannot detect the drones used by Ukraine. That's why the Ukrainian army has information about all the plans of Russian soldiers. Today, the Ukrainian army started to monitor Russian soldiers in the Russian-occupied Novoaida region. These soldiers were making preparations in ammunition depots. Russian commanders who examined this preparation realized that a new ammunition transfer would be made to the region. Russian soldiers were organizing two warehouses to make room for the new weapons and missiles. The Ukrainian army soon determined the route along which this ammunition would arrive. Railroad plans in Luhansk Oblast were examined and Russia's secret plan was exposed. HIMARS, the most powerful missile system of the Ukrainian army, recorded the coordinates of the transit points on the railroad. The operation started as soon as the Russian army transported ammunition by trains. HIMARS missiles destroyed trains carrying Russian ammunition. The Russian convoy went up in flames. It is known that this train contained a large number of rifles and bullets. There were also thousands of grenades, gas grenades, rockets, and other ammunition used in positions. After the destruction of this train, all the attack plans of the Russian army were disrupted. The Russian army wanted to advance in Ukraine by conducting operations from this region because this region is very close to Crimea. The Ukrainian army is getting closer to Crimea every day. Russia wants to stop this advance of the Ukrainian army in order not to lose its control in Crimea, because Crimea has very important symbolic values for Putin. Putin's administration invaded Crimea in 2014. This invasion was presented as Putin's greatest achievement since those years. Putin still brags about occupying Crimea. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in liberating Crimea, it will be a major blow to Putin's reputation. Putin is doing everything in his power not to lose Crimea, but the Ukrainian army is doing everything it can to liberate Crimea. Ukrainian President Zelensky also thinks that the liberation of Crimea is very important. Zelensky said this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. Zelensky also mentioned Crimea in another interview. The reporter asked Zelensky what he would like to do first when this war is over. Zelensky said, "I want to swim in the sea with the people on the Crimean coast." Zelensky's statement proves how eager he is to liberate Crimea. The Ukrainian army has proven itself to the whole world with its successes on the battlefield. Ukrainian soldiers are considered to be among the most successful fighters in the world. Many combat videos from the battlefield show Ukrainian soldiers gaining the upper hand against Russian soldiers who are much more numerous than them. The Ukrainian army is making history on the battlefield. The Russian army is shaming the whole world. Russian soldiers made the whole world see the truth in this war. Putin was constantly threatening the whole world and implying that the Russian army was capable of taking over the whole world because of Putin's aggressive policies and threats. Everyone thought that Russia had a very powerful military arm. Putin had technical information about his army and kept saying that Russian soldiers were very well trained. But when the war started, the truth came out. It turns out that most Russian soldiers are very bad at even holding a gun. Russian soldiers drop their weapons on the front line. They don't know how to throw bombs and never win a battle. Russian soldiers experienced great fear and their combat training is very poor. Also, the tanks and other weapons used by the Russian army are not as good as they think. Russian tanks proved to be very flimsy in the war. The Ukrainian army has managed to destroy 3,201 Russian tanks since the beginning of the war. Russia's artillery and air defense systems are also useless against Ukrainian weapons. The Ukrainian army is using the most advanced weapons sent by NATO. These weapons are inflicting a heavy defeat on the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is very lucky with ammunition following negotiations by the Ukrainian president. NATO members are sending the most advanced weapons to Ukraine. Finally, work has begun to send Leopard 2 tanks and Patriot missile systems produced in Germany to Ukraine. After the delivery of these vehicles to Ukraine, the Ukrainian army will become much stronger, especially thanks to the land operations to be carried out with Leopard 2 tanks. Many regions will be liberated from the occupation of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is waiting for the tanks to be delivered as soon as possible. As a result of Ukraine's operations using Leopard 2 tanks, Russia may withdraw from this war completely, because Russia's military capacity is no longer enough to win this war. It is known that many leaders in the Kremlin are pressuring Putin to withdraw from the war. What do you think about the extraordinary operations of the Ukrainian army? Do you think the Ukrainian army is successful in these operations? What do you think about Russia's heavy defeat? Do you think there will be a conflict in Crimea? What do you think about the NATO weapons used by the Ukrainian army? The battle for Bakhmut continues and the Russians are launching one wave of assaults after another. A lot of reports suggest that the Russians have advanced along the whole front line and got even closer to the center of the city. But in actuality, if you look at the closest Russian positions to the city, we can see that the Russians only took control over the garbage dump and haven't even reached the Ukrainian defense line. As of now, Bakhmut is being stormed from three sides with the most intense fights taking place in Opit. Even though the Russians did not establish full control over Opit and the fights are still taking place on the first intersection of streets, many sources indicate that the Ukrainians decided to abandon Ivangrad altogether. There are big pros and cons to this decision. On the one hand, Ivangrad is a much thinner settlement with only 2 lines of houses, since it is a separate settlement supplying nitrillion acquires crossing the field, which is extremely problematic because this field is located in the lowlands so the Russians can see every Ukrainian move between these 2 villages. So retreating from the settlement allowed the Ukrainians to save a lot of resources, otherwise they would be losing too many men by trying to defend a weak position. On the other hand, by giving Ivan-Horod to the Russians, the Ukrainians inevitably facilitated the development of the Russian offensive. After the Russians took control over Ivangrad, their area of control increased significantly. Now the Russians in Ivangrad can effectively shield their forces in Vesela Dolina and provide cover for their advances. And this is exactly what the Russians did. As you might still remember, in the aftermath of Ukrainian counterattacks last month, the Russians completely lost their positions to the southeast of Bakhmut. But now, with the good cover from Ivangrad, they could start advancing in this direction once again. Their first target became St. Pits, since it is almost on the same level as Ivangrad. they established control over this region without significant hurdles. After that, their second target became the local garbage dump. Here, the Russians also had an advantage because there is a long trench around the dump which impedes movement from the Ukrainian side, but allows to easily enter this object from the Russian side. However, further advancement proved to be complicated, and the garbage dump remains the closest Russian position to the city. The Ukrainians still control 2 industrial areas around the dump, which is exactly where intense fights are taking place. What is interesting is that if we look at the invasion map of Bakhmut, we can see that the Russians haven't even reached the main Ukrainian defense line. If we go back to the satellite image, we can infer where exactly the Ukrainians have established their defenses, and it looks like they are leveraging the natural barrier in the form of swamps. Crossing the swamps to assault the residential area is extremely difficult, which indicates that the Russians might focus their efforts on either attacking the industrial area to the west of their current positions or the residential area to the north of their current positions. In any case, the fact that the Russians have a very limited number of options allows the Ukrainians to allocate the resources more efficiently by focusing only on these 2 areas. The Russians actually tried to take control over the industrial area in the past, but once they got control over it, they became an isolated group in the corner and were defeated during the Ukrainian counterattack. When it comes to the eastern part of Bakhmut, we can observe a similar situation. First of all, the Russians focused on isolated objects on the outskirts. Once they got a toehold and established control over some buildings, they immediately started developing their operation further and assaulted the industrial zone before the Ukrainian counterattacks that happened last month. The Russians actually advanced much deeper as the fights were reported past the Seniat factory. But now the Russians are only trying to re-establish control over this area. And the latest news from the Russian side indicates that the Russians have only managed to take 1 of 4 factories in this region, which is also the smallest one. Interestingly, if we once again look at our invasion map, we can see that the Russians haven't reached the main Ukrainian line of fortifications here either. If you go back to the satellite map, we can easily understand why the Ukrainians created it behind the supposedly good defense objects in the form of industrial areas. As you can see, there is a small river that divides this part of the town. Therefore, the Ukrainians are not really engaging a lot of heavy equipment here as the bridges are destroyed. The Ukrainians are mainly using their infantry, which is allowed to step back if they are overwhelmed. The Ukrainians therefore created several fallback positions, which they only used to inflict higher losses on the Russians. Overall, despite the heavy fights and hundreds of troops falling in combat, the Russians have extremely unimpressive gains in the least protected areas of Bakhmut, so the actual battle may not have started yet because the Russians have not reached the main defense lines created around Bakhmut.